Welcome to medieval India. Episode 21. Jahangir. In the course of the second half of the 16th century, a vast empire had taken the place of a number of independent states, and Akbar's descendants eventually conquered India as far south as the Kaveri River. But the test of their power was their ability to maintain their authority over a vast country through which communications were difficult and the chief of the outlying provinces of which were constantly tempted to throw off their allegiance. The Mughals always remembered what was said of Mahmud of Ghazni. Unable to administer what he already possessed, he yet goes on to conquer new countries. Akbar had won the goodwill of the people of India. With their contrasting principles of Hindu caste hierarchy and Muslim equality by religious toleration. But that policy was reversed with increasing emphasis by his successors, and when to the burden of the heavy taxation of Shah Jahan were added the persecutions of Aurangzeb and the factional fighting during his weak successors, Mughal power gradually dwindled. Jahangir's first act after his accession was to promulgate a series of reforms, of which the most important was the abolition of transit and custom duties. These edicts were at least a manifestation of good intentions, however much they were nullified by local government officials. The new emperor, when his father was dying, had frustrated the intrigues to put his own son, Khusru, on the throne by engaging to uphold Islam and not to punish those who had plotted against him, and he kept both these promises. But within 6 months, Khusru, evading his arrest in Agra fort, escaped to the Punjab and stirred up a rebellion. With Husayn Beg and Abdulaziz as his chief adherents, about 650 retainers, and with an army of peasants and freelancing soldiers, Khusru marched upon Lahore, obtaining from the Sikh Guru Arjun a sum of money and his blessing. According to the Guru, not because he was a prince, but as he was needy and without friends. Dilawar Khan, governor of the province, rapidly put Lahore in a state of defense and held out with a small garrison until Khusru's forces were dispersed by the imperial troops. The leaders of the ill-fated rebellion were captured and brought before Jahangir. The fate of the wretched prisoners who were taken has been recorded by the emperor himself. Quote, Khusru was brought into my presence in the garden of Mirza Kamran with his hands bound and a chain on his leg, and he was led up from the left side according to the rule of Genghis Khan. Husayn Beg was on his right and Abdulaziz was on his left. He stood between them, trembling and weeping. Husayn Beg, suspecting that they would try to make a scapegoat of him, began to speak sorrowfully, but they did not allow him to continue. I gave Khusru into custody, and I ordered those 2 villains to be enclosed in the skin of a cow and of an ass, and to be placed on asses, face to the tail, and so to be paraded round the city, that is Lahore. As the skin of a cow dries quicker than the skin of an ass, Husain Beg lived only to the 4th watch, and then he died. Abdul Aziz, who was in the ass-skin and had moisture conveyed to him, survived. To strengthen and confirm my rule, I directed that a double row of stakes should be set up from the garden to the city, and that the rebels and others who had taken part in this revolt should be impaled thereon, and thus receive their deserved most excruciating punishment. Jahangir then rode in state through the lines of his victims, followed by Khusru, who was invited to accept the homage of his subjects. Khusru was partly blinded and sentenced to imprisonment for life. As Jahangir afterwards observed, quote, "Constantly have I borne in mind the observation of that best of guides, my father, that there were two things of permanent utility to the sons of sovereign princes: prudence and fidelity in availing yourself of opportunities, the one indispensable to the preservation of sovereign power, and the other to the maintenance of a course of good fortune. But too frequently, felicity in promoting a career of prosperity is found extremely inconstant, and after a very limited period it slips through our fingers, never to return." An even more distinguished victim of the rebellion was Arjun, the 5th Sikh Guru, and the first compiler of the Adi Granth, the earliest and holiest of the Sikh sacred scriptures. Jahangir fined him heavily for helping the rebels, and on his refusal to pay, tortured him to death. Jahangir states in his memoirs that he called for Guru Arjun on account of the charge brought against him that he had put a saffron mark on the forehead of the rebel Prince Khusru as a token of his blessings. As a prince, Jahangir, he further wrote, had heard about his shop, which had been doing brisk business for 3 or 4 generations, before Guru Arjun started luring ignorant Muslims as well as foolish Hindus to purchase his falsehoods. Many a time had it occurred to Jahangir, he further writes, that either this shop of falsehood should be closed, or Guru Arjun should be brought into the fold of Islam. He ordered Guru Arjun to be put to death, his mansions and his family to be entrusted to Murtaza Khan, and his property to be confiscated. It should be noted, however, that Jahangir's punishment was more prompted by political considerations, a perceived need to stem a potential rebellion, than because he resisted leaders of heterodox sects. Like Akbar, Jahangir too sought out prominent holy men who were no potential political risk, such as the widely venerated ascetic Gosain Jadrup of Ujjain, whose hole dug in a hill the emperor repeatedly visited. During the 17th century, 5 gurus succeeded Guru Arjun. His son, Guru Har Govind, was succeeded by a grandson, Guru Har Rai. The younger son of Guru Har Rai, Guru Har Krishan, was succeeded by a great-uncle, Guru Tek Bahadur, the youngest son of Guru Har Govind. Guru Govind Singh, who succeeded his father Guru Tek Bahadur in 1657, abolished the personal guruship before his death in 1708. The action of the state authorities was a stunning blow to the followers of Guru Arjun. Whether it was due to the intrigues of the slanderers of the Guru, to the enmity of some local administrator, or due to the autocratic prejudice of the emperor, the injustice was still patent enough. Guru Hargobind reacted to the event in proportion to the enormity of the injustice. He girded on two swords, as the Sikh tradition puts it, one symbolizing his spiritual authority and the other his temporal powers, and he encouraged his followers to follow martial activities. The many Jats, a traditional warrior caste amongst his followers, needed little persuasion to do so anyway. Such a clear departure from the practices of his predecessors made Guru Hargobind more conspicuous in the eyes of the administration, and on their representation Jahangir ordered his detention in the fortress of Gwalior. Before long, however, counter-representations were made on behalf of Guru Hargobind, and he was released. The emperor appears eventually to have felt satisfied with the justification given by the Guru for his interests and activities. Guru Hargobind was left free to pursue them for the rest of Jahangir's reign. But many Sikhs could not appreciate the measures adopted by Guru Hargobind. In contrast to the former Gurus, they said, the present Guru did not stay long at one place. He was sent into imprisonment by the emperor. He roamed the land without fear. He kept dogs and he went out hunting. And he was accused of giving preference to scoundrels over his devoted servants. Others asserted, however, that Guru Hargobind was bearing an unbearable burden and that the true Sikhs remained devoted to him. The new measures of Guru Hargobind were justified with the argument that an orchard needs the protective hedge of the hardy and thorny kilkar trees round it. In other words, the Panth of Guru Nanak now needed physical force and armed men for its protection. We shall return to the Sikhs in a later episode. But let us now first turn to one of the most fascinating figures of Mughal India. Nur Jahan, whom Jahangir married in 1611 and who survived him by 18 years. Mirza Ghiyas Beg, the father of Nur Jahan, belonged to a noble family of Tehran, and his father had served as governor of Yazd under Shah Tahmasp the Safavid. The family fell on evil days after the death of Ghiyas' father, and Ghiyas Beg migrated to India in search of employment and fortune. On his way to India, his daughter Nisa was born in 1577. Mirza Ghiyas was presented by Malik Masood to Akbar at Fatehpur Sikri. Being a talented and experienced man, he soon rose in the estimation of the emperor. At the age of 18, Nisa was married to Ali Quli Ustazlu, known as Sher Afghan, the tiger thrower, who had first served under the Safavid Shah Ismail II and had then come to India and taken service under Akbar. In the reign of Jahangir, Ali Quli Beg received a suitable mansab, was styled Sher Afghan, and was given a Jagir in Bengal. But it was reported to Jahangir that Sher Afghan was insubordinate and disposed to rebellion. Qutbuddin, who was sent to Bengal as governor in 1606, confirmed the reports of Shah Afghan's disloyal intentions and ways, and he was instructed to send him to the court. But Shah Afghan slew Qutbuddin during an interview, and he was killed by the followers of Qutbuddin in turn. His young widow, Nisa, was sent to the capital, and she was entrusted to the care of Jahangir's mother. Her son first met her at the annual mock bazaar held at court, where all the ladies pretended to be market vendors and the emperor and his retinue purchasers, and he was immediately smitten by her. 4 years after the death of her former husband, Nisa was married to Jahangir. She received the title of Nur Mahal and later on of Nur Jahan, by which title she is renowned. The young widow, who was profoundly attached to Jahangir, soon gained ascendancy at the court. Jahangir, as his memoirs record, was as proud of her prowess when tiger shooting with her matchlock as he was of her wisdom in solving the intricacies of financial affairs. The emperor himself was a prey to the family failings of drink and drug abuse, but Nur Jahan was able eventually to moderate these bad habits, which, outside the Mughal court circle, were uncommon amongst and abhorred by the common people. Her ambitions and her influence and active participation in state affairs increased apace with it. The chronicler Mutamid Khan's plain account is both authentic and reliable quote. All her relations and connections were raised to honor and wealth. No grant of land was conferred upon any woman except under her seal. In addition to giving her the titles that other kings bestow, the emperor granted Nur Jahan the rights of sovereignty and government. Sometimes she would sit in the balcony of her palace while the nobles would present themselves and listen to her dictates. Coin was struck in her name with this superscription: by order of the King Jahangir, gold has 100 splendors added to it by receiving the impression of the name of Nur Jahan, the Queen Begum. On all firmans, also receiving the imperial signature, the name of Nur Jahan, the Queen Begum, was jointly attached. At last Jahangir said that he had bestowed the sovereignty on Nur Jahan Begum, and he would say, "I require nothing beyond a seer of wine and half a seer of meat," that's measures, in any matter that was presented to her. If a difficulty arose, she immediately solved it. Whoever threw himself under her protection was preserved from tyranny and oppression, and if ever any orphan girl was destitute and friendless, she would bring about her marriage and give her a wedding portion. It is probable that during her reign no less than 500 orphan girls were thus married and portioned. One immediate effect of Nur Jahan's influence was the rapid promotion her brother Asaf Khan and father Itimat-ud-Dawla received. Even without Nur Jahan to help them, they might have ascended to the top for their marriage. But Nur Jahan accelerated their promotion, and the Mughals gained greatly by the ability and the devotion of these two highly talented officers. In 1612, Arjumand Banu Begum, better known as Mumtaz Mahal, daughter of Asaf Khan, was married to Prince Khurram. I shall have a lot more to say about this other great dame of Mughal politics in the next episode. For the next 10 years, those 4 supremely capable persons practically ruled the empire. What has been called Nur Jahan's sway was really the sway of those 4 personages. And there was always plenty to do. Throughout the reign, unrest had to be suppressed. An unfortunate incursion into Little Tibet, modern Ladakh, and a year later came the successful campaign against the Portuguese, which we shall deal with in the next episode. Hostilities with Mewar had been going on for half a century, but the Mughal hydra was indestructible. Every victory, while it cost the best blood of Mewar, only multiplied the number of its foes. 17 pitched battles had the Rajput king Amar Singh fought since the death of his father, but the loss of his experienced veterans withered their laurels of victory, nor had he sufficient repose either to husband his resources or to rear more young heroes to replace the fallen. Another and yet more mighty army was assembled under Prince Khurram. Again did the Raja with his son Garan collect the might of their hills, but a handful of warriors was all their muster to meet the host from Delhi, and the crimson banner, which for more than 800 years had waved in proud independence over the heads of the Kulhilo royal family, was now to be abased to the son of Jahangir. The rest can be told in Jahangir's own words. Quote, Sultan Khurram, by dint of placing a great many posts, especially in some places where most people said it was impossible to place them on account of the badness of the air and water and the wild nature of the localities, and by dint of moving the royal forces one after another in pursuit, without regard to the heat or excessive rain, and by making prisoners of the inhabitants of that region, brought matters with the Rana to such a pass that it became clear to him that if this should happen to him again, he must either flee the country or be made prisoner. Being without remedy, he chose obedience and loyalty, and sent to my fortunate son his maternal uncle Subkaram with Haridas Jala, who was one of the 2 men in his confidence, and he petitioned that if that fortunate son would give forgiveness to his offences and tranquilize his mind, he would himself wait on my son and would send his son and successor Karan Singh, and he, after the manner of other Rajas, would be enrolled among the servants of the court and do service. But Jahangir, in finally making Udaipur a tributary state, granted the most generous terms, and went so far as to erect statues of the Rana and of his son below the audience window of the imperial palace. Akbar had to put an end to his personal conduct of the Deccan campaign after the siege of Asirkar in 1601 on account of Salim's rebellion, as we saw in the previous episode. After Akbar's return, the campaigns were carried on indifferently, and further advances or consolidation were made impossible by the senseless bickering of the Mughal officers among themselves. And when Jahangir returned to the Deccan, after his armies had been relieved from the Mewar campaign, he found himself now opposing the great Malik Ambar, one of the ablest soldiers, administrators and statesmen the Deccan, and indeed India, has ever produced. Although its capital city and its adjoining places were occupied by the Mughals, and had been made a separate Suba of the empire, an extensive part of the kingdom of Ahmadnagar had still remained in possession of influential Nizam Shahi nobles like Malik Ambar and Raju Deccani. They acted independently of one another and owed allegiance to no king. But it was to the credit of Malik Ambar that he would revive the fallen kingdom rather than seize power himself, and that he imparted to it a fresh lease of life. Malik Ambar was born in an obscure Abyssinian family in 1549. He was originally a slave of Khwaja Baghdadi, who had purchased him in Baghdad. He was then sold at Ahmadnagar to Genghis Khan, the minister of Murtuza Nizam Shah I. Genghis Khan had 1,000 slaves, and Ambar was one of them. The sudden death of his master cast Ambar in a helpless condition, and for more than 2 decades he struggled hard, serving sometimes as an ordinary soldier in Ahmadnagar and sometimes in Bijapur. But those lowly officers could not satisfy such an ambitious man. When Abang Khan was opposing Bahadur, he joined his service and was soon promoted to the rank of commander of 150 horsemen as a reward for his good services. After this time he established himself as an independent chieftain, just like his contemporary Shahu Bonsle, of whom we shall have a lot more to say later. And the disorder and confusion of the country, paired to the large numbers of warriors available after all the incessant conflicts of the last decades, afforded ample opportunities for such ambitious fortune seekers like Malik Ambar or Shahu. At the time when the Mughals were busy in the siege of Ahmadnagar, he, by his repeated sallies on the unruly men of the frontier lands, made their life so miserable that they were compelled to come under his leadership. They soon swelled the number of his followers from 500 to 2,000, and encouraged by such successes, he continued from one daring exploit after another, until he made a sudden sally on Bidar, whose army he defeated. This victory enhanced his resources in men and money. After this he became bold enough to make surprise attacks on the Mughals in Ahmadnagar and plunder them. Ever more followers now came flocking to his standards, and many Nizam Shahi nobles now joined him too, adding to his strength and prestige. Thus he had become the most powerful factor in the Nizam Shahi politics, and brought under his possession the Nizam Shahi country from the Telangana border as far north as within 1 kos of Bir and 4 of Ahmadnagar, and from 20 kos west of Daulatabad to within the same distance of the port of Chaul, as the chronicle says. Having thus reinforced his position, he now took up the cause of the fallen Nizam Shahi dynasty, which he wanted to reinstate at all costs. He was not aspiring to kingship himself, and ultimately managed to find a surviving scion of the Nizam Shahi family, Ali, the son of Shah Ali, who was then residing in Bijapur. His coronation as Murtuza Nizam Shah took place at Parendra, which was fixed as the temporary capital of the kingdom, and Malik Ambar became the prime minister and the Wakil Sultanate, or regent of the kingdom, and he gave his daughter in marriage to the king. Murtuza II, who ruled from Christian era 1600 to 1630, was merely sultan in name, while the entire governmental machinery was run by Malik Ambar. Yet he would have to tackle not only the many internal problems of the kingdom, but fight the relentless Mughal imperial hydra as well. To that end, Ambar sought an alliance with Ibrahim Adil Shah II of Bijapur. As Ambar said to him, quote, It is my design to fight the Mughal troops so long as life remains in this body. It may be that through your Majesty's daily increasing fortune, I can now expel the Mughals from the Deccan." Ibrahim Adil Shah II was also interested in an alliance with Ahmadnagar to check Mughal aggression to the south, and this had prompted him to concede to Ambar's request to place a member of the old Nizam Shahi family on the throne. In 1609, Jahangir sent Prince Parviz to the Deccan as governor of Berar and Khandesh, and he invested him with supreme command to lead the campaigns, while he also ordered a general named Nur Jahan Lodi to proceed there. But despite those reinforcements, the Mughal position deteriorated rather than improved. Prince Parviz had neither the talent nor the energy nor the urge for strenuous military pursuits. Thomas Rowe, who visited him in his camp, has left a graphic account of the hollow pomp and ceremony at the sumptuous court that Parviz held in the field instead of an army camp. But while the prince delighted in show, he was slow in acting too. Nur Jahan Lodi's planned surprise attack on Ambar only ended in failure, and Malik Ambar on his side was a master in lightning guerrilla warfare known as Bargiri in Deccan. This consisted of not meeting the enemy main force in the field, but cutting off his supplies, maneuvering for the best position, and using superior mobility to strike vulnerable locations far from any battle site. The Barkiri aimed to harass the countryside on which the Mughal army depended for fodder, while impeding or disrupting the oxen caravans which provided it with food. Lodi's condition became so precarious that he had no other alternative but to patch up a disgraceful treaty with Ambar and retire to Berhampur. This campaign, which now assumed a defensive character, dragged on without much success from 1609 to 1615. The Khan-i-Khanan, Khan Jahan Lodi, Khan Zaman, Man Singh and Abdullah Khan all tried in turn, but they all failed and frittered away their energies in senseless recriminations against each other in the meantime, all to the advantage of the enemy. The Khan-i-Khanan was again put in charge of the operations in 1612 and won some successes, but he was ultimately relieved of his command by Prince Khurram, whose military fame was then at its height. Prince Khurram reached Berhampur in 1617 and Jahangir himself moved to Mandu at the same time. The presence of the Mughal prince in the Deccan himself, with a superbly equipped army, dismayed the opponents by itself. The long and disastrous war had sapped the material resources of the Nizam Shahi kingdom, and when Khurram proposed peace on the payment of tribute and on the restoration of the lost territories, the offer was readily accepted by Malik Ambar as well as by the Bijapuri ruler. The territory of Balaghat was ceded to the Mughals, and the keys of the forts of Ahmadnagar and other strongholds were delivered. Khurram appointed his own officers to the recovered territory and retired to Mandu amidst great rejoicings and festivities, by which occasion he was honoured by Jahangir with the title Shah Jahan, by which he is better known. But all that Khurram had succeeded in doing was to hastily patch up a ceasefire with the forces of the Deccan kingdoms. Nothing could, writes historian Beni Prasad, conceal the stern reality that the expenditure of millions of rupees and thousands of lives had not advanced the Mughal frontier a single mile beyond the limits of 1605. Ambar's chance came 2 years later when Jahangir was in Kashmir and the Mughal officers in the Deccan were embroiled in their common petty bickering and rivalries. He allied with Bijapur and Golconda, and with about 60,000 cavalry he marched into the former territory of Ahmadnagar, recovered lost places and besieged Ahmadnagar itself. An army was left to carry on the siege, while he marched triumphantly towards Berar. He then besieged Berhampur, crossed the Narmada and plundered the surroundings of Mandu. Shah Jahan was once more ordered to proceed to the Deccan immediately. Ambar, who did not dare to take the risk of an open engagement with him, gave up the siege of Ahmadnagar and retreated. But the prince gave the Deccanese a hot chase and pursued them to the very gates of their new capital, Kirki, that was later on to be renamed in honor of the Emperor Aurangzeb, Aurangabad. The Mughals then demolished the fine buildings of Kirki, and Ambar, in his insecure position, opened negotiations for peace. Shah Jahan had meanwhile also to contend with many difficulties, and those compelled him to accept the offer of peace. Besides promising to restore the territories occupied from the Mughals in the course of the last 2 years, Ambar agreed to surrender 14 kos of the adjoining country to them, and moreover the 3 kingdoms of Ahmadnagar, Bijapur and Golconda had to consent to pay altogether 50 lakhs of rupees as tribute, that is 5 million. In 1621, the relations between Bijapur and Ahmadnagar broke down and both kingdoms now sought a Mughal alliance. The latter were finally tempted by the offer of Bijapur, and Malik Ambar decided to harass the territories of Bijapur. He marched against Bidar, which had been under the domination of Bijapur since 1619. By a surprise attack, he defeated the Bijapuri army and pillaged Bidar. His next move was against Bijapur itself, and Ibrahim II, who was unable to oppose him in an open fight, withdrew into the walled city, which was besieged by the Nizam Shahi army. In response to his appeal for Mughal assistance, the Mughal governors of Ahmadnagar marched in conjunction with Mullah Muhammad Lari to Ibrahim II's aid. Alarmed, Ambar repeatedly appealed to the Mughal officers not to support Bijapur and allow Ahmadnagar and Bijapur to settle their own differences, but all in vain. The approach of the joint armies forced him to raise the siege of Bijapur and retreat to his own territory. But the Mughals closely pursued him, and he fell back on Badwadi, about 10 miles southeast of the fortress of Ahmadnagar. By cutting the embankment of the Badwadi lake, he filled the adjoining areas with mud and water, and rendered it impossible for his enemies to approach his camp. Heavy rainfall worsened the situation. To make the Mughal-Bijapuri alliance's position still more miserable, Ambar carried on surprise night attacks, plundering the enemy's camp, and made it impossible for them to receive any supplies. Scarcity of food caused such distress among the joint forces that many deserted the camp. The rival parties had encamped close together, and at length both of them arranged their forces for an open engagement. First the Mughals and then their Bijapuri allies suffered a crushing defeat. Ambar's death in 1626 at the age of 80 sealed the fate of Ahmadnagar and opened up the Deccan to Mughal designs. The chronicler Mutamid Khan, no particular admirer of Malik Ambar, still testified to his qualities in the following words, quote, "This Ambar was a slave, but an able man. In warfare, in command, in sound judgment, and in administration, he had no rival or equal. He well understood the predatory warfare, which in the language of the Deccan is called barkiri. He kept down the turbulent spirits of that country and maintained his exalted position to the end of his life and closed his career in honor. History records no other instance of an Abyssinian slave arriving at such eminence." End quote. And Malik Ambar was surely not only one of the greatest statesmen of the Deccan, but he is a forgotten great African as well. His revenue system is another instance of his far-sighted and constructive genius. Although new in the Deccan, it was based primarily on the one Raja Todar Mal had introduced in northern India and some parts of Gujarat and Kandahar. Ambar's objects were threefold. First, the good of the peasantry. Second, encouragement and promotion of agriculture, and third, the enhancement of the government revenue. Lands were classified as good or bad depending on their fertility, and this classification took great pains, and it took a number of years to ascertain the average yield of lands. Ambar abolished the revenue farming that was common in all the sultanates of the Deccan, and he relieved the peasants from the oppression of the tax farmers. At first, revenue was fixed as 2/5 of the actual produce in kind, but later on the cultivators were allowed to pay in cash the required sum, representing about 1/3 of the yield. Although an average rent was fixed for each plot of land, the actual sums collected depended on the crops and the harvest, and they were adjusted year by year depending on the harvest. Such clemency of the government with the peasants' lot was indeed so new to them that Malik Ambar has figured to them ever since as the semi-legendary just ruler. The Henry IV of France, William of Orange of the Netherlands, or Elizabeth of the Deccan. The system encouraged cultivation of wasteland too. This not only enhanced production but also augmented government revenue. Shivaji and then the Marathas were to follow his administrative and his revenue system, as we shall see later. The most important features of Jahangir's foreign policy when seen in retrospect were his relations with the Dutch and English newcomers in India. At the beginning of his reign, Portuguese supremacy in eastern waters was already waning, but their influence at court was strong enough to prevent the earliest English merchants from obtaining trade concessions within the empire. The situation at Agra changed in 1613 when the Portuguese, for lacking a Portuguese passport, seized and plundered 4 imperial ships in which the Dowager Empress had a large interest. Jahangir expelled nearly all the Portuguese from the empire, interdicted Christianity and besieged Daman, while the governor of Surat made an alliance with the English, who engaged the Portuguese viceroy's fleet in an indecisive firefight that in the entire English literature is obviously pictured as a great victory. The Portuguese then came to terms, and the Mughal-Portuguese treaty remained in force for the rest of Jahangir's reign. The mischief, however, was done. Now that the Portuguese were clearly no longer in uncontested control of the sea, English prestige rose as Portuguese influence declined, and the prospects of the English traders were further improved by the arrival of Sir Thomas Roe at the imperial court, with whom we have dealt before. Jahangir had no direct dealings with the Dutch company. However, if in retrospect the appearance of the East India companies may appear as the most momentous event of Jahangir's time, it was barely noticed at the time. In fact, the appearance of other Europeans than the familiar Portuguese was completely ignored by the Mughal chronicles. These were, as said, affairs of and mostly between maritime traders that were but of limited interest to an elite whose income depended on land revenue and tax assignments in the interior. Indicative of the priorities of Mughal foreign policy is that, while Roe was at his court for 3 years, Jahangir in his diary spends not a word on him, besides a fleeting notice he had sat in a European coach that Roe had given him. But he spent scores of pages on the reception of a Persian ambassador who stayed there for no more than 3 months. The one, after all, was an affair between lowly merchants, while the other concerned grand politics. For Babar had brought to India an unfulfilled ambition for recovering his ancestral lands of Fergana and Samarkand, and it, coupled with the exigency of defending India from possible inroads from northern Afghanistan or Badakhshan, and from the Uzbek Khanate, ushered in the Mughal policy towards the Persian Empire and the Central Asian princes. The constant danger of Shakatai Uzbek mass inroads into India, which kept Akbar in the north of India for the final years of his reign, much as their Mongol and Timurid ancestors had themselves done, impelled the Mughals to cooperate with the Persian Empire. This frustrated the attempts of the Ottoman sultans to draw them into a religious alliance of the Sunni powers against the Shias of Persia. The Mughals, further, were estranged from the Uzbeks because of their traditional hostility to the House of Timur. As we saw in episode 14, after all, Babar had been chased out by Shah Bani Khan Uzbek, and by their constant propaganda against the Mughals amongst the tribesmen of the northwest. The relations of the Persians and the Mughals were usually friendly, although the Persians adopted a patronizing attitude towards the Mughal Empire, which constantly irked its emperors. Be it because the Persians saw Indo-Persian culture as a junior branch of their far senior culture, and as mentioned, the greatest Indo-Persian poet had indeed said his poetry was still of the weft of Shiraz, or be it because of Humayun's visit to and him factually owning his crown to Shah Tahmasp. With it, the Mughal emperor had subjected himself to Persia, as Tahmasp's Safavid successors continued to perceive it. Though the Mughals thus owed a lot to the Safavids, there were 2 grounds of conflict. Kandahar was coveted by both, and the Shiite states of the Deccan, with whom the Mughals were often at war, were on excellent terms with Persia, and they at least recognized the Safavid Shah as the leader of a Shiite bloc of states against the Sunni coalition that was led by the Ottomans and that included the Khanate of the Crimea, the Barbary states, the Uzbeks, and very vaguely faraway Aceh in Indonesia and Morocco. Kandahar, was a constant bone of content between India and Iran in the 16th and 17th century. The fortress was of critical strategic importance as securing the Sindh and Baluchistan frontier of the Mughal Empire and the access to Khorasan for the Safavids, and it was the great meeting ground of the trade routes of Islamic Central Asia. It was said that 14,000 camels passed through it every year. It was double important in the late 16th and especially in the early 17th century, as the Portuguese had a stranglehold on the seaborne trade between India and Persia by their control of Hormuz, the access to the Persian Gulf. And all traders there were chased away by the extortions of Portuguese officials, as the Portuguese admitted themselves, so that the Mughals tried to develop Kandahar as an alternative to Hormuz. Besides, the Safavid monarchs regarded Kandahar as an appanage of Khorasan, and they considered a Mughal occupation as nothing but an usurpation, whereas the Mughals saw it as an extension of Kabul instead. At Akbar's accession, it was governed by Bayram Khan's agent Shah Muhammad Kilati. In 1558, a large Persian force led by Sultan Husayn Mirza invaded Kandahar and took possession of it. For the next 36 years it was to remain in Persian hands. As he was occupied in India and with troubles in Kabul and on the frontier with the Uzbeks, Akbar could not make any attempt at the recovery of Kandahar. But by the year 1590 he had become the paramount sovereign of northern India. Kabul had been annexed to his empire, and the revolting Raushanite tribe there had been subdued for the time being. The Uzbeks had become supreme in Khorasan, and they were threatening the Safavid kingdom, so that they could not send forces there. Clearly, now was the time for a sudden blow to recover Kandahar. Akbar dreaded as well the capture of Kandahar by the Uzbeks, in which case Kabul and the Punjab would be open to invasion. Accordingly, in 1590 he sent an army under Abdul Rahim to recover Kandahar, but the Khan-i-Khanan turned to the conquest of Sindh instead, probably as a prelude to the conquest of Kandahar. This postponed the expedition, and circumstances that made it unnecessary. Mozaffar Husayn Mirza, who held the government of Kandahar, feared an Uzbek invasion and may also have learned of Akbar's plan to recover Kandahar. Shah Abbas of Persia was then not in a position to send him reinforcements. Mirza Husayn, therefore, refused the offer of help by Abdullah Khan of the Uzbeks, who had sent him an envoy, and surrendered the fort instead on 18 April 1595 to Akbar's officer Shah Beg Khan. And then he left for the Mughal court. A populous country came into possession without a battle, as chronicler Abul Fasl exulted. Or rather, it had come into possession by the successful sowing of divisions amongst the enemy that had been the central maxim of Indian statecraft since the very days of Kautilya in the 3rd century before Christ. Jahangir's reign opened with an unsuccessful attempt by the Persians to occupy Kandahar again. That attack was not wholly unexpected is evident from a remark in Jahangir's diary. Quote, "It occurred to me that the death of His Majesty Akbar and the unreasonable outbreak of Khusru might put an edge on their design and that they might attack Kandahar." End quote. Be it added that Persia had meanwhile come under its greatest monarch. Abbas I, the fool equal to Akbar in splendor, in diplomatic cunning, and in military skills. A semblance of friendship was however maintained after this incident, as Abbas alleged that he had no knowledge of the whole affair and sent his officers to apologize for the indiscretion of his frontier governors. In April 1611 he sent a formal embassy and a letter which closed with the prayer, quote, that the tree of hereditary friendship and assiduousness and the garden of intimacy and regard may acquire greater splendor and greenness. Jahangir sent an embassy in return in 1613, and several more missions were exchanged. But though Shah Abbas was interested in good relations with the Mughal Empire as a buffer against the Uzbeks, he was also very much interested in preserving the independence of his allies in the Deccan, and he resented the rapid extension of the Mughal power there. The Deccan Rebellion of 1621 might have been connected with the Shah's attack on Kandahar a few months later. The Shah could only assist his Deccan allies by creating diversions on the northwest frontier and by occupying Kandahar. He had received envoys from Kish and Makran and hoped someday to extend the boundaries of his empire to the right bank of the Indus. It is no coincidence that the Nizam Shahi envoy, Jais Khan, was with the Shah during the siege of Kandahar. Although Jahangir talked a great deal about strengthening the fortifications of Kandahar, little could be done owing to the attitude of Prince Khurram, and Kandahar fell after a feeble resistance in 1622. It has been suggested that Prince Khurram was in cahoots with the Shah, as he knew that with the loss of Kandahar, Jahangir would be busy in suppressing the wave of unrest in Afghanistan and amongst the frontier tribes, and that this would leave him a comparatively open field in the south. The relations with Persia were tense after the occupation of Kandahar by the Persians, but as he was both preoccupied with a war against the Portuguese for Hormuz that fell in 1623 and with one with the Ottomans for the control of Iraq, Shah Abbas was anxious to patch up his relations with the Mughals. After Jahangir's death, Shah Jahan sent an embassy to Abbas' successor, Shah Safi II of Persia, to offer condolences on the death of Shah Abbas. Shah Jahan in this letter reminded him of the old friendship between the two dynasties and stated that the late Shah had treated him in the days of his vicissitudes as an uncle should treat a nephew. But in spite of the embassies which solemnly pledged cordial relations, Shah Jahan still had his eyes fixed on Kandahar and plotted to profit by the unrest that followed the death of Shah Abbas and the youth and experience of the new Shah Safi. The death of the great Shah Abbas had in fact revived the hopes for vengeance which all anti-Persian rulers had been cherishing. An attempt was once more made by the Ottomans and Uzbeks to form an anti-Persian league, but Shah Jahan, like Akbar, occasionally flirted both with Persia and her enemies and would definitely commit himself to neither side. He was anxious to get back Kandahar, however, as he considered himself honor-bound to recapture a place which had been lost through his own previous negligence and ambition. Equally keen was his old hereditary ambition to occupy the ancestral lands of the Mughals. In the beginning, Shah Jahan wished to confine himself to diplomatic efforts and conserve his resources for his intended recovery of Transoxania, as we shall see in the next episode. And for that he needed Persian cooperation, if at all possible. It was not till he was disappointed in that direction that he openly approached Persia's enemies with the proposal for an alliance. The Shah's differences with the governor of Kandahar gave Shah Jahan the wished-for opportunity. Ali Mardan Khan, the Persian governor of Kandahar, had been in arrears with his revenue, as he sought to take advantage of the disturbed state of the country to establish himself as a separate ruler. He was summoned by the Shah to appear at the court, but avoided doing so. On being dismissed from office, Ali Mardan sought the assistance from the governor of Kabul and the commander of Ghazni. In 1638 he surrendered Kandahar to the Mughals and received from Shah Jahan, as a reward, 100,000 tankas for himself and 200,000 for his brother and the officials of his army. Elaborate preparations were now made by Shah Jahan to hold the fort against the Persians. The Shah was too busy at the time fighting the Ottomans in Iraq to take any effective measures for the recapture of Kandahar. In a letter to the Shah sent in 1638, Shah Jahan justified the occupation of Kandahar, apologized for any misunderstandings that might have been caused by this action, and advised the Shah to forget the incident. No diplomatic intercourse took place between the two empires till after the death of Shah Safi. Shah Jahan later on sent an embassy to his successor Abbas II to secure Persia's neutrality for his projected Central Asian campaign. There was a strong anti-Mughal party at the Persian court, but the Shah also feared the Sunni powers of Central Asia, and he preferred to remain a silent observer to that campaign. When Nasr Muhammad Khan escaped to Persia, Shah Jahan wrote to Shah Abbas II to explain the causes which had led to the Mughal campaign, and he expressed the hope he would succeed in conquering Samarkand and Bukhara. In December 1648, the Shah suddenly turned towards Kandahar. Mughal prestige was then very low owing to the disastrous failure of the Mughal military venture in Central Asia, as we shall see in the next episode. The Shah also succeeded in securing Turkish neutrality during his eastern campaign. The Persian expedition started in winter, as the Shah was aware Indian troops detested fighting in winter. The fort of Kandahar was occupied by the Persians in February 1649. Shah Jahan sent 3 different expeditions against Kandahar in 1649, in 1652 and in 1653, but the Mughals could not recapture the fortress. As one of the court historians admits, quote, "The Persians had become experts in the capturing and defense of fortresses after their long wars with the Turks. They were masters of firearms and artillery. They held a strong and well-provisioned fort with big guns and skilled gunners, who in one day fired 25 times on the covered lane which had reached half the way across the ditch, and destroyed it." End quote. Whereas even with their best guns and gunners, the Mughals had difficulties firing their biggest guns even once a day. No diplomatic relations were maintained with Persia during the rest of Shah Jahan's reign. At the outbreak of the War of Succession in 1658, Murad and Dara Shikoh tried to enlist the support of the Shah, who actually moved his troops to Kandahar. But the success of Aurangzeb was so rapid that the Shah had to withdraw his troops. Thus commenced the dean of Mughal historians, Yadunath Sarkar, quote, "These 3 futile sieges cost the Indian treasury over 10 crores of rupees, that is 10 million, and ruined the Mughal prestige in the eyes of all Asia. The Persian king could rightly boast that the ruler of Delhi knew how to steal a fort by means of gold, but not how to conquer it by strength of arms." Throughout the rest of the reign of Shah Jahan, the rumor of a projected invasion from Persia used to throw the court of Delhi into the greatest alarm. End quote. Mughal failure against Kandahar is a sad commentary on the degeneration that had set in the Mughal army, its discipline undermined by the pittiness and the factual spirit of its commanders. Through this, the Mughal army had lost both strength and morale. Another cause of failure was the inefficient and ineffective artillery of the Mughals, that was simply no longer on a par with that of the Persians, the Ottomans, or, ominously, the Europeans in India. Above all, the meddling of Shah Jahan and a divided command made the successful pursuit of the campaign impossible. However, in 1616 the internal state of the empire was clearly more critical than the outcome of any of Jahangir's foreign campaigns. The general unrest and the court intrigues over the rival heirs, Khusru, the captive hero of the people and the choice of the older nobility, and Khurram, the favorite of the queen's party, threatened the emperor with assassination and the country with civil war. Thomas Roe felt it necessary to warn the East India Company to keep their agents collected in a few places, not to extend their business up country and avoid politics, lest there was the civil war which everybody dreaded. But the Queen's party extinguished the popular hopes by transferring Khusru from the guardianship of Raj Singh Dalan to his enemies, and the unfortunate prince died in the custody of Khurram, now Shah Jahan, in 1621, when Jahangir was lying seriously ill. The official announcement made at the beginning of 1622 that Khusru had died of colic is contrary to the popular belief at the time that the prince was murdered by order of his brother. A year earlier, Jahangir had taken the Hindu stronghold of Kangra after a siege of 14 months. In a subsequent visit, he outraged the religious feeling of the inhabitants by ordering a bullock to be slaughtered and a mosque erected within the fort, one of the few intolerant acts of his reign. In 1622, as we saw, Kandahar was taken by the Persians and Shah Jahan was given command over the army to be sent to recover the city. Prince Parviz, a drunken non-entity, was now his only rival to the throne. But Shah Jahan felt that absence from the court, when his father might die any moment, was too great a risk for his own prospects for succession. He refused to obey the emperor's orders, and by breaking into open rebellion, he justified Nur Jahan's suspicions of his loyalty and her conviction that he had become a danger to the state. Shah Jahan was joined by Abdul Rahim, the Khan-i-Khanan, an old man of 70 who had been loaded with honors by Jahangir. Virtually all the governors and troops in the Deccan sided with him. The rebel army marched on Agra and was met by the imperial troops, nominally commanded by Prince Parviz, but actually led by Mahabad Khan, the best general of the empire and the governor of Kabul. The royalist forces inflicted a bloody defeat on the Deccan forces at Bilojpur near Fatehpur Sikri on 29 March 1623. Retreating through Malwa and the Deccan, while being pursued by Jahangir and Nur Jahan's army, Shah Jahan reached Bengal, where he reorganized his forces and gained some temporary successes. He then put his forces on river boats to ascend to Agra, but at Kampat near Allahabad. In 1624, Mahabad Khan again defeated him, and Shah Jahan left his wife Mumtaz Mahal and his youngest son Murad Bakhsh in the great citadel at Rohtas on the Ganges, while he himself escaped to the Deccan to seek refuge with his former enemy Malik Ambar. The Khan-i-Khanan had surrendered after Bilojpur, and the old minister was kindly treated by the emperor. But it was more than a year before Shah Jahan finally wrote to Jahangir imploring forgiveness. The answer came from Nur Jahan, stating the conditions on which his submission would be granted. 2 strongholds which he held had to be surrendered, and his sons Dara Shukol and Aurangzeb sent to the imperial court as hostages in all but in name. The terms were accepted, but for his own safety Shah Jahan chose to remain in the south until his father's death. In under 4 years the situation of 1622 had entirely changed. Shah Jahan was now no longer a menace, but Mahabad Khan was. Mahabad Khan-i-Khanan, the victorious general and now the most powerful man in the empire, was now a source of danger, as he had the drunk-sodden Prince Parviz, a prospective heir to the throne, under his influence. The humiliation of Khurram was a cause of quiet celebration for Nur Jahan, but the prominent part played by Mahabad Khan in it and his alliance with Prince Parviz was not at all in her favour or to her liking. With the object of separating them, Mahabad Khan was ordered either to proceed to Bengal or to repair to the court immediately. Meanwhile, various charges were brought up against him. He was said to have taken large sums of money due to the state and from the Jagirs too. He was held not to have sent to the court elephants that had been captured in Bengal, and he was guilty of contumacy in betrothing his daughter to the son of Khwaja Umar Naqshbandi without the previous permission of the emperor. He visited his wrath upon the young man by openly disgracing him and seizing all that Mahabad Khan had given him. Mahabad Khan obeyed the royal summons and came north from the Deccan with 4,000 brave Rajput warriors personally attached to him. Jahangir was then on his way to Kabul, and he was encamped on the banks of the Jhelum. Asaf Khan, who was with the emperor, crossed over to the other side with the troops, women and children, but before the emperor could go across, Mahabad Khan captured the bridge and stationed 2,000 of his Rajputs there, while he himself proceeded to the royal camp. And he said there to the emperor, quote, "I have assured myself that escape from the malice and implacable hatred of Asaf Khan is impossible, and that I shall be put to death in shame and ignominy. I have therefore boldly and presumptuously thrown myself under your Majesty's protection. If I deserve death or punishment, give the orders that I may suffer it in your presence." Meanwhile, Mahbub Khan's Rajputs had come flocking into the royal quarters, and the emperor found himself suddenly surrounded by armed men. Jahangir wanted to strike Mahbub Khan with his sword, but his chamberlain cautioned with the words, "This is no time for fortitude. Leave the punishment of this wicked, faithless fellow to Allah. A day of retribution will come." Mahbub Khan, who was likely himself surprised at this sudden stroke of good fortune, then said, "It is time to go out riding and hunting. Let the necessary orders be given as usual, so that your slave may go out in attendance upon you, and it may appear that this bold step has been taken by your Majesty's order." The emperor and his Khan-i-Khanan together would act as if everything was peace and harmony between them, and as if the emperor's writ still ran through the land. When Nur Jahan heard of this, she gathered her officers, bitterly reproached her brother, and she attempted to force her way across the river, as said the only time a Mughal army was commanded by a woman. The attempt failed, however, though Nur Jahan later succeeded in joining her husband in factual captivity. Asaf Khan fled and shut himself up in the fortress at Attock. Nur Jahan was now left entirely to her own resources, but she did not lose her nerves and continued to work against Mahbub both in private and in public. Mahbub Khan, who was now in control, restored Jahangir to his daily routine, and the court proceeded on its normal march towards Kabul. After the court had arrived there, Muhammad Khan continued to guard the emperor and to direct the daily business of the empire. He had no backing except that of his Rajput guards, and there was no prince of the royal blood in his hands to serve as his trump card. Jahangir acted out a pose of cheerful compliance with the demands of Muhammad Khan, but on the return journey from Kabul towards Lahore, near the fortress of Rohtas, Jahangir asked for a muster of his own and his Mansabdari troops, and he asked Muhammad Khan to keep his Rajputs apart. As soon as the royal troopers had lined up, Muhammad Khan, seeing the inevitable, fled the camp, and the general, whose temporary chagrin had forced him into this disloyal cause, then submitted. He was ordered to release Asaf Khan and to proceed against Shah Jahan, whom rumour had credited with renewed disloyalty. Muhammad Khan promptly made his peace with the prince, whose position was greatly strengthened by the death of Parviz in October 1626. While returning from his annual visit to Kashmir in 1627, Jahangir, suffering severely from asthma, was taken fatally ill, and he died on the 28th of October at Chengiz-Khan in the foothills of the Himalaya. He was buried at Shadara, close to Lahore. Jahangir possessed neither the complex character nor the outstanding intellect of his father, but was far from incompetent. He lacked Akbar's insatiable spirit of inquiry, and religion did not vitally interest him. Like Akbar, he enjoyed listening to debates between the Jesuit fathers and the mullahs. But although he surrounded himself with a gallery of pictures of the saints of the Catholic Church, This was in part due to his love of art, and in part his patronage of the Jesuit mission suited his foreign policy. Hinduism had no appeal to him, and he ignored the teachings of the reformed sects, Muslims and Hindus, beyond persecuting popular preachers and ascetics when he believed they might become a danger to the state. Even in the case of Shaikh Ahmad of Sirhind, who claimed to be the Mahdi, and that of the Shvetambara Jains of Gujarat, with their prophecy of the impending fall of the empire, measures against them were not prompted by religion but by political considerations. Unlike Akbar, Jahangir would never descend to details, and the local officials had in practice absolute power over those with whom they came directly in contact, and a successful appeal against oppression was extremely rare. The rule of Jahangir under the influence of Nur Jahan and her family council fell short of the very high standards of the government of Akbar's time. But for many years to come, a sufficient number of foreign officials of the right stamp were available to save the administration from inefficiency or too blatant corruption, and the empire was indeed to have its golden age under Jahangir's successor Shah Jahan.